Welcome to the Three Things Podcast. I'm David Iglesias, Director of Wheaton Center for Faith, Politics, and Economics. You may be wondering why this podcast is called Three Things. You were probably taught by your parents, like I was, that it was impolite to talk to people about three things: religion, politics, and money. But what happens if your job is to talk about those three things? Well, join me for the next 25 minutes and let's find out. Welcome back to the second half of our discussion with Bonnie Wurzbacher, former Senior Vice President of Global Customer Leadership at Coca-Cola, and then Chief Development Officer at World Vision International. Today, we will explore her transition from the corporate world to the nonprofit world and also hear her insights on faith and work. So you were there for a long time, and then you weren't. You transitioned to the nonprofit world. Was that a difficult transition, and how did you know when it was time to leave Coca-Cola?
Yeah. It was not a difficult transition. It was a really exciting transition, and it was indirect, not direct. So first I decided to leave Coca-Cola. And then I actually had more than a year, so something like 14 months before I went to work for World Vision. So in a nutshell, I left Coca-Cola because I felt like I had made all the contributions I could. Mm-hmm. And I hit all of the milestones that I needed to in order to be able to financially retire, to be able to get my pension. And Coca-Cola had probably still has, but maybe not quite as good, of a great pension program, and the stock options were good and everything, so that I really didn't need to stay, and I was just ready professionally to leave.
Okay.
And I knew it I told them about a year and a half before I did. So I left very well and on very good terms, and doing a particular project I really wanted to do before I left. And then I promised my husband I would take at least a year off, but I figured I had one more thing in me. I was just 55, and I wasn't ready to stop working, but I was ready to do something else, and I didn't know what. So I spent that year or so doing a little bit of consulting and interviewing at all kinds of different places, and praying and really thinking about what I would want to do next. And I have often said that where we serve God best in our work and in our life is the intersection between what we're good at, our skills, what we're passionate and interested in and love, our passions, and where God leads us. And I call that the can do, the want to, and the led to. And when they come together, that is going to be the place where you can serve God best. And that's true in quote unquote retirement. That's true in business. It's true in nonprofit. It's true in your home. And so I didn't know that yet, but I was looking for that. And my largest consulting client became World Vision US. Ah. And my Bible study started reading The Hole in Our Gospel by Rich Stearns, who at the time was the president of the World Vision US. They're based in Seattle. And I learned a whole lot about what that organization was about. And in the last month of my time at Coca-Cola, one of my friends who also went to Wheaton and had just left Opportunity International to go to World Vision about a year earlier, learned that I was leaving Coke and started writing me and calling me and telling me I needed to check out World Vision, that this would be a good place for me. And I mean, he was relentless. And so I went 6 weeks after I left Coke to a conference that they put on. It was actually for major donors. I didn't even know that, but it was a conference they put on. And that's how I ended up connecting with that senior leadership and how they became my client. From there, I realized about 9 months later how much I really enjoyed that organization, but couldn't see what job I would do there and wasn't prepared to move to Seattle. And all of a sudden, a headhunter reached out to me with the job that I ended up eventually going into at World Vision International, which was their global headquarters, and at their executive office hub that was based in London. And so all that to say, to answer your question specifically, when I went there, not only did God clearly lead me there in the process that I explained to you, as well as my husband's agreement to move to London, he was talking me into it, and the selling of our second home in Texas and all kinds of other things. The leading thing was clear, but what was really surprising and the most fun about it was that it's so built on the skills and experiences I had at Coke. It was global. I was working not in a franchise bottling system that's very indirect, and I was working directly with customers, but also with bottlers and also with the company, and you always had this three-way win you had to find, and that's what World Vision was like. And I was responsible for the 20 fundraising countries. They raised $3 billion a year.
Oh my!
It was then spent in 80 other countries on long-term humanitarian aid work. And I was responsible for being on their boards, working with their marketing leaders, helping to fill vacant president roles, and helping them fund the work better. The work, helping them to get the kind of funding needed and a strategy for that was really needed in the field, and to do it working together. I was the first one in that role, so I also ended up creating that role. They had created it, but I was the first one to actually bring it to life and do it.
Well, what I'm hearing you say, it sounded as though your time at Coca-Cola prepared you for this job.
Exactly.
That's fascinating.
It exactly did. And I think that is so godlike. I think he does that all the time. I think he prepared me for the work I'm doing in my retirement. I'm doing lots of work. I just don't get paid for it, I tell people. But I still try to spend my time in that can to, want to, led to space. That's where I'm most effective.
No, I can relate to that. Everything I've done has got me ready to teach here at Wheaton and run the center. So
yeah, for sure.
Your comments resonate.
Great.
Here's an easy one for you, or maybe it's not. Major accomplishments in the profit world and in the nonprofit world. What would they be?
In thinking about that, they all revolve, my major accomplishments revolve around a certain area. And this is both at Coke and at World Vision. And that is, they all related to my strengths, and they all related to starting things. Starting up initiatives, leading new initiatives that addressed a big problem that they were having, that the organizations were having, and globally. All but one of them was global. Starting with my very first big accomplishment, the one I'm the most proud of at Coke. It was when I was 29. I started with them when I was 27. And I was the first one to sell Minute Maid orange juice to McDonald's worldwide. And they had sold them Coca-Cola for a long time, but they had never sold them orange juice, and there was a long story why. And I decided that the only way we could earn their business and earn their trust and earn their respect back, and they were now big in breakfast, which hadn't existed 10 years earlier and growing, and was to go to where they needed our help, which was internationally, not in the US. Right. And we had no international customers at Minute Maid. Everything was a bottling customer. And so Minute Maid wasn't global. Minute Maid was frozen, a frozen product primarily, or chilled, and was not made through its bottlers. Still, most of it isn't today. Some of it is, the stuff in the cans, but that didn't even exist. So I literally had to figure out how to sell them and then figure out how to get it to them. We shipped it directly from our supplier in Brazil and set up a freight forwarding office outside my office. And we started internationally until we won the first big market in Atlanta. And then their other supplier called us and asked if we'd purchase them. And overnight we got the rest of the business. So that's my favorite story, because it was I didn't know what I couldn't do, and it was exciting, and it was new, and it was strategic. And I do best, and I know this in the work I enjoy the most, when I'm right in the middle of strategy and execution. I want to be able to affect strategy, but if I can't get it done, I go, I'm too much of a pragmatist. I think I have to be able to have one foot in both worlds. So when I can be helping to solve a problem and strategically, and when I say strategically, it's important to the business. It's a part of their growth strategy. Is what I mean by that. And then figuring out a new way to get it done. So McDonald's was one. I started up the school and college business across North America for Coke, which was a new emphasis nationally. It had always been locally by bottlers. I was the first one to start their global customer approach. They didn't have a good way of working with customers that crossed countries. Mm-hmm. They had figured out how to do it in a country across bottlers, but not across countries, and how to get all the bottlers on the same page with that. I led that initiative. I led the design and rollout of their 5x20 initiative. That was that last project before I left, which was how they could fulfill their commitment to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, mm-hmm. and how we could use our business model for that. And then when I went to World Vision International, it was the first one to start up a role that worked with the fundraising offices and sat on their boards. They never had anyone from World Vision International on their boards or working with them or getting them working together. They just kind of volunteered it. Never had a global funding strategy. So those are the things that I love doing, and those are my biggest accomplishments and the things I enjoyed the most. And when I would veer away from that is usually if I needed to do something, but I'd come back to something like that as soon as I could.
So our listeners can think of you the next time they have an orange juice at McDonald's.
Yes,
breakfast.
They can.
Okay, I had not heard that story before. Thank you for sharing that. How about setbacks? Can you maybe share a setback?
Yes, I can. Everyone has setbacks, and just like in our personal life, setbacks are usually the primary way we learn. Trials, yes. And setbacks. And if you're not having any, you're either not trying enough, mm-hmm. hard enough, or you're not learning much. But when I think about my biggest setbacks, I would say one of them, a couple of them were working for difficult bosses that we just had really different styles. And that was hard. One of them was someone I had worked before and had a really great relationship with. And then in a different role, it really broke down and was really hard. And those were hard things to work through. I was able to, like I mentioned, I had a number of different jobs at Coke over the years, some longer term, some shorter stints. But I was able to leave two bosses without leaving the company.
Oh my.
And just, it kind of got down to where we couldn't resolve it. So I just moved on.
Right.
I would say the other thing from a job perspective is the job I thought I really wanted last at Coke was Chief Customer Officer, which didn't exist when I was doing the whole project around how we should lead global customers. I was vice president of global customer strategy, working for the president of the overall global company. And along the way, about, I'd say 2 years into that, 2.5 maybe, where everything was up and running and we had customer teams around the world and a bottler council around global customers. And we decided, at my recommendation, to create a chief customer officer role. Mm-hmm. And I wanted it, and I interviewed for it and didn't get it. Mm-hmm. And I licked my wounds on that for a while. Mm-hmm. And then that person moved eventually into another role. He was a longtime person at the company, leader. And I had another shot at it, and I didn't get it the second time. Mm-hmm. So that was probably my biggest setback in terms of what I felt, how I felt about it. There really wasn't, I realized after a while there wasn't really another role I could grow in that all contributed to my decision to leave. But upon reflection, I realized that one of the things that gave me was the ability to speak so broadly for now, many, many years about the theology of business and about integrating faith and work. I had started to speak on that already. I started actually at Wheaton in 1998. Wheaton's Chapel is when I first developed my theology of business for that talk. But I was senior enough to have a real platform to use, to give it. But I think if I had been in the chief customer officer role, reporting to the CEO or the COO, mm-hmm. it would have been far harder for me to do that, to speak as boldly. And I always used Coke as a great example, right, but I still really was very direct with my Christian faith and how I integrated it. And I think I would have had to likely be far more careful and far more edited.
Yes.
If I were in that chief customer officer role. So I think in that regard, it was a real blessing.
So it sounds like you're an advocate of the faith at work movement, for lack of a better word. Are you? And or do you have a variation of what people normally call faith at work?
Well, as I mentioned, when I first got serious about talking about my faith and work, I was always thinking about it that way, was when I was invited to speak in chapel. And I decided I was going to speak on serving God in business. That's what I called it. I called it business in God's kingdom. That's what I called it. Because I felt that if I had ever had any business role models, I would have been a business major. Mm-hmm. At Wheaton, mm-hmm. and started off in it sooner. So I wanted to speak on that. And there really wasn't a faith and work movement back, maybe a few little dribbles here and there of a few people that had written on it, but not anywhere what it is like now. But I found a couple of great books that are still probably my 2 favorite books that informed my thinking, as well as lots of Bible study. In fact, the 2 books I would recommend and the Bible study I would recommend now for people is the first book is, and you'll know this, is Business is a Calling by Michael Novak.
Yes.
Who died a year or 2 ago. It's still my favorite book, hands down, on the significant purpose of business and how our faith intersects with it. Another one was Total Truth by Nancy Pearcey, which goes beyond just that, but it's about a Christian worldview. And it was the real first book on Christian worldview with lots of examples of how people started to recognize that they were called to serve God in their work, through their work. And so that's my second one. And then right now, the Theology of Work project at theologyofwork.org has amazing resources and a Bible study. I think it's a 9 or 10 week Bible study that you can take online that's the biblical basis for why our professional work is so important to God. So those would be 3 resources I would suggest.
Well, that's really, really helpful. In a sense, in addition to having a military background, I have a legal background, but when I spoke in chapel, I think it may have been a little bit easier because of the number of verses that talk about justice, because I was in the justice business.
Yes.
Whereas there's not nearly, I don't think, the number of verses that talk about business or...
I don't know. There's probably more verses that talk about money.
Lots of verses.
And there would certainly be more people in the Bible that were in business than were in politics.
Yeah. I'll have to do a word search.
Yeah. I think the Bible has a ton to say about it, and not just about work now, but work, at the end of the day, I've mentioned the theology of business. I think all work has a theology behind it.
Yes.
Which is what I think faith and work is. I don't think it's about learning to share your faith with your coworkers or starting a Bible study at work. As good as both of those things are,
right,
that's not what I consider. And so maybe I veer differently. That's not what I consider the theology of work or the integration of faith and work. I think we're called to do that everywhere. Mm-hmm. But the theology of our work is basically answering the question, what is God's purpose in his kingdom, both here on earth and, by the way, probably for eternity, but we don't know for sure there. But right. Here on earth, what is God's purpose for this work? What is the value of his work in his kingdom? And how can we join Christ in restoring that aspect of work? So for business, what I think the theology of business is that God's purpose for business in his kingdom on earth is to contribute and build the economic well-being of communities. And I mean big and small businesses in every community in the world. So to advance their economic well-being, and as the only source of wealth creation, to allow every other institution to exist, social, civic, spiritual. So I think that this is going back to my comment about how we're seeing this at play right now, is that all nonprofits and every non-business pretty much is a nonprofit.
Right.
Schools, colleges, I'm talking schools, colleges, churches, governments, every 501c3, every NGO. And what makes them different is they don't, the product and service that they provide doesn't generate revenue or doesn't generate enough revenue to cover their expenses. That's the difference. And they get exempt from taxes, so they're also not contributing anything to government. So if you think about it that way, I mean, that's just right. The scientific definition of it, not considering it all products or services anywhere, just assuming they're all equal, and they're probably not all equal. They can't thrive. They can't not only thrive, they can't work, they can't pay their employees, they can't do their work without other sources of revenue. And those sources of revenue come mostly from private donors.
Right.
Sometimes from taxes, government. When I think of like universities and schools, particularly public ones that get a lot of their funding from governments, they cover some of their costs from, scholarships, but they're all dependent on it. And that's why it was so easy actually to move from Coke, where I was in a revenue generating kind of a job, to World Vision, where I was in a revenue generating kind of job, because to many people's surprise, most people that work in nonprofit work spend the vast majority of their time raising money
right.
in one way, shape, or form for that organization, because it's so critical. Yet most people that are drawn to that work are drawn because of the product or service they're providing. So mm-hmm. Take World Vision, for instance. Their mission, I gave you Coca-Cola's mission, so I should give you theirs, is to follow Christ in working with the poor and oppressed, to promote human transformation, seek justice, and bear witness to the good news of the kingdom of God.
Beautiful.
They do this long-term development work primarily. They do some short-term emergency work, but primarily it's 15 to 17-year long-term development work in the poorest communities, 2,500 communities. It's awesome work. Most people go to work for them because they love that.
Right.
But they have to raise globally $3 billion a year to do that work well. And it can't just be any $3 billion. It's got to be $3 billion that is the kind of funding they need to do that work.
Right.
So, for example, their biggest, probably 50% globally anyway, of their revenue comes through child sponsorship because it connects a person to a specific child. The money doesn't go to that child. It goes to the community, where the work in that community where that child lives. And it comes regularly. So they have this recurring cash revenue. When you add it all up, it's, little bits. It's might be only, $39 a month. But when you add up enough of them, it's enough to pay sustainably for a staff in that community and the drilling of the wells and the doing of the long-term work that they do. And then the other things, like big grants from major donors or a government grant or other special one-time giving, goes to deepen that work or to specific projects that need a real infusion of cash. Right. But the bread and butter lifeblood is the child sponsorship that provides the ongoing revenue that allows that long-term work to sustain. So it was easy for me because I got how to do that. And nonprofit organizations are far more complicated at the end of the day because they have two value streams. The one in which they do their work, you have to be able to do that development work well, right, and measure its impact and do it better than someone else could do it, for people, because you have to get donors to give to you versus the thousands and thousands of other options they have, and to give you the kind of funding they need in the kind of places they need it, and to keep it in balance and to help the donors feel part of the work and yet still have real impact. And you have to keep those in balance. And that means they need business people, yes, and sales people and people that understand not only how to raise, but how to allocate and steward the funding and the work back to donors. It takes really a ton of business skills, and it's just not that obvious until you get into the middle of it.
Which is why your background was perfect for their needs.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I'd love to continue this for hours. Unfortunately, I don't have that time. But a question I always ask my interviewees is this: is there anything I haven't asked you that I should have?
Not that I can think of. I like to end. I'd like to end when I speak on this. I'd like to end it in my talks with a comment, though, that when I was working full-time professionally, that I felt God's pleasure in the product and the process of my work because of the way it enabled so many people around the world to use their God-given gifts for good and for God. And that's true both. That was true at Coca-Cola. It was true at World Vision. It was even true in teaching. Mm-hmm. That I think we are called professionally to serve God and others in His kingdom here on earth and help in restoring it. And that is the greatest reward for a job well done.
On that very encouraging note, Bonnie Wurzbacher, thank you for your time and for your wisdom. Blessings to you and your family.
Thank you, David.
You've been listening to a podcast from the Wheaton Center for Faith, Politics, and Economics. You can find us at wheaton.edu/FPE.